Hello and welcome to Fridays with Fintelekt. My guest today is George Pearmain, Director of Financial Crime Strategy for the Government of Jersey, which, as we know, is a leading international finance center. George, thank you so much for joining this conversation today.
Good morning, Shirish, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to your listeners.
Thanks, George. So, George, just a few words about you before we begin so that our viewers get to know. So, George is a lawyer by background with vast experience in public and private sector work. He has recently worked in the FATF Secretariat as well. George acts as the head of delegation for Jersey to Moneyval, which is the European FATF-style regional body, and has significant experience engaging with other international bodies, standard setters, and jurisdictions worldwide on financial crime matters. But to begin with, George, can you give us a preview into your personal career so far in the world of AML CFT and financial crime compliance, and also about your current role as Director of Financial Crime Strategy for Jersey?
Sure, no problem, Shirish, and thank you very much for your summary intro. I should probably start by saying that I started life never having any intention to enter the world of financial crime. It happened completely by accident. I started my life as a litigator in the courtroom and eventually did some cases which linked to issues around fraud and financial crime matters. And then after a change in private practice, I went to the government for a period of time to do a discrete piece of policy work around the trust law in Jersey, which is one of our kind of leading products and areas. After 6 weeks of doing that work, there was an option to continue onwards and do some other projects, which I continued to do across the legislative sphere. And about 2 years later, after those initial engagements, I found myself in a permanent role heading up the island's approach to financial crime when Jersey was initially facing its first evaluation by Moneyval in 2015. I then went on to lead a more general role around our financial crime legislative and policy work before heading off to the FATF Secretariat in 2018 to spend some time there. Which for me involved working with the the FATF style regional bodies, the FSRBs around the world. And for me, that was particularly working with ISAMLAG in Eastern and Southern Africa and the Caribbean FATF in the Caribbean. And also being involved with a mutual evaluation process, which for me was evaluating the United Arab Emirates during that period of time, which led me back to Jersey in the earlier part of this year, just before March, when the world significantly changed with COVID. And to a new role with a new team inside the government of Jersey, which really is developing our policy capability and our strategy around preventing financial crime and really continuing the aim of Jersey, which is to be a world leader in financial services, providing international financial services to the world, but critically with the utmost commitment to preventing against our systems being used for criminal conduct.
Excellent. Thanks, George. So, George, Jersey recently published its national risk assessment, and I saw a fantastic video on LinkedIn. And can you take us through the key highlights, findings, and recommendations of the NRA that may be useful for other countries, to gain a better understanding of the threats and vulnerabilities that are facing Jersey? And maybe if you could also give us a high-level view of the future action plan.
Sure, no problem. So I should say with the video, it's amazing what videographers can do to make a project seem more exciting and interesting. But it's been useful to have this option to engage with a wider audience around what we've been doing here in Jersey. I should say that national risk assessments are not easy tasks, and any country that's gone through the process will appreciate that it's a huge coordination exercise, which takes a lot of time, and ensuring you have the right data and the right people to conduct this exercise is not easy. That's why ours started in 2016 and has been a 4-year journey for the first exercise. In Jersey, we don't have the same facilities as larger countries would have. So, for example, we don't record information in a central bank on financial flows. So this means that data gathering exercises to actually understand what's going on the ground and the risks we're exposed to take longer and they're more complex. So the first stage of this process was a very large data gathering exercise, particularly along the lines of what was inside the World Bank methodology for conducting the risk assessment, but also enhancing that for characteristics which are specific to an international finance center. So that would mean that, for example, in Jersey, we have a banking and a trust sector that's a significantly larger than you would find in a country of our size normally. That meant we need to obtain a lot of information in for it to ensure that the decisions we were making on risks were based on quantitative, real information and not, for example, on thoughts, suspicions, ideas. We wanted this to be accurate and correct. So the publication process was very long, and in Jersey, we involved a large number of practitioners in the industry, hundreds literally, across 12 working groups in different sectors. What the NRA concluded, I think, were things that did not surprise us. Our three largest industries, so for us, that is banking, trust and company service provision, and funds services business, presented the highest level of threat to the jurisdiction, although I think we would like to examine that threat in some more detail in the next stage. And that those were performing well in terms of the controls, but the risks were very high in those areas. And so we found our three largest areas of practice in higher risk areas. So this was not surprising to us. Another conclusion that we found, which was interesting for the International Finance Center context, is that lawyers, and particularly lawyers involved in corporate structuring, were more exposed to money laundering risks than you would find in other jurisdictions, because often they may be the only party in the transaction that may have the overview to identify what may be a scheme in a complex structure for money laundering in an international finance world. In terms of actions, we cut this down to 10 residual risks. And those 10 risks range from data gathering, which whilst we did a good data gathering exercise, we need to be more precise and to get more next time. It ranged from the ability to develop policy and strategy faster, and in a more agile way, particularly responding to emerging threats that are coming out. So one good example of that is the changing threat nature that virtual assets present in the world, and also the immediate and very present threat that criminality related to COVID presents. There was also some findings around cross-border threats, so that we needed to understand more and in better detail the specific threats that certain jurisdictions pose to us. And that will be a series of work that will continue over the next 6 to 12 months. There were equally findings around the use of technology to better share intelligence and information between authorities in order to identify where criminality may be occurring and to investigate it effectively. And really all of this was brought together in what was probably over 200 granular actions that we're now working through implementation over probably the next 2 years.
Right. So, George, combating financial crime in a way is like hitting a moving target, right? In the 2 years that it took the NRA, so I think it finished you took data from 2000 till 2018, right, for 5 years. But then from 2018 to 2020, there could be some data or findings that haven't been included in the analysis. So how do you take care of that when you actually start implementing?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because this is something that had concerned us. The period of time was certainly longer than we would have liked. But in publishing the document, we have refreshed this by looking at more emerging trends that are coming out. And we also have work scheduled in specific areas over the coming months. So one of those, for example, is doing a risk assessment on virtual assets in order to implement a regime in line with the new revised FATF recommendation 15. Other areas which we're looking at because the risk is emerging, we'll be doing more work in, for example, the funds sector, because the securities marketplace is probably the area worldwide where money laundering typologies and trends are least understood, and more detail is really needed to truly understand how those markets could be abused by criminals. And those are the areas in which we have done significantly more work more recently. Now, what we'll do in order to keep the risk assessment up to date will be to be publishing refreshes on a fairly regular basis. And we want to build this into a better set of engagement with our industry. Not just our industry here in Jersey, but actually those that we deal with cross-border, because our business truly is truly international, serving over 1 million customers and having over £1 trillion of wealth under management. In doing that, we want to be able to develop that risk understanding, which the FATF standard calls for. And in doing that, we want to be able to publish more regular updates of risk on a website, both publicly and to our industry in a more interactive way.
Right. Josh, coming to a slightly, I would say maybe a sensitive topic, there is a widely held belief that IFC is at time, arguably, look the other way when they are used either as placement centers or as transit points for large funds related to money laundering or corruption. And that any show-off effort, to stop this may really be superficial. So firstly, what is your opinion about that? And specifically for Jersey, at what point in the entire chain of business acceptance to conviction would you say that the most work needs to be done to ensure that the jurisdiction is not perceived differently as compared to the real situation on the ground?
So thanks for the question, Shirish, and I'm glad you've raised it because it's something we always look to speak about as openly as we can. It's entirely unsurprising that when you consider the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, and more recent information that has come out, that finance centers can be accused of facilitating international criminal finance globally. The reality of those on the ground is very different. The finance centers are very committed to ensuring that their business model remains robust, and that they appreciate that the only way that can maintain is by ensuring that criminality is rooted out at all areas of financial services. And so for finance centers, it's particularly important for us to better understand our risk and how we can be used to facilitate criminality, which is often occurring elsewhere. And therefore, that brings us to a really important part around this. You asked about where we may be used in the chain. Now, the issue we tend to see is finance centers being used where the predicate criminality occurs abroad. And in our NRA, we mention a number of those areas of criminality which we've identified through intelligence, typologies, and cases. That ranges from tax evasion to corruption, to fraud, to bribery. The list of predicates is really significant. And the only way that we will understand where we can be used is by having a better understanding of the countries in which the criminality is occurring and that the funds may be transmitted to Jersey. So traditionally and still, it's our belief that we are likely to be used in the layering process of money laundering. But the way to combat that is firstly awareness. So awareness that if there is a particular threat coming from a jurisdiction, so you can see in the detail of our NRA, we go through a number of jurisdictions that we identify as higher threat, and the detail identifies the particular type of criminality in that country in which the threat may be coming from. So it's not as simple as saying that all of the business from X country is presenting a higher threat. It's usually specific types of business. And for Jersey, that particularly affects the trust and company service provision area and the underlying banking activity. And you can see that from the cases. So our commitment here is twofold. Firstly is to identify where criminal funds may be approaching the jurisdiction. The industry here are generally very good. We have a very good industry in terms of reporting and screening. The difficulty often comes in terms of investigating a report or intelligence that comes in, and particularly in relation to cooperation with jurisdictions elsewhere, because it will often only be that if we can gain the cooperation of the jurisdiction abroad, that we will have all the pieces to bring a successful investigation to a court case. And this is where you can see that in Jersey, we have a couple of good examples, cases such as Winwood Trading, which involved the proceeds of corruption from Kenya. It takes a significant period of time to bring those cases to court, often due to the issue of obtaining evidence from the foreign jurisdiction. But we're now moving forward, I suppose, with the risk assessment to understand how we can better enhance that cooperation. And one of the things is reaching out to our partner countries and our partner agencies to discuss how we can achieve better cooperation and better awareness of risks both ways. And so that's really how we're trying to develop that understanding and to develop that cooperation to ensure that we create that truly deterrent effect in Jersey and that it's understood to criminals that if they do indeed wish to transfer foreign assets through Jersey, the chances of detection, investigation and prosecution will be very high.
Right, right. So, George, it would be a fair assumption that the NRA will actually result in the, let's say, revision or formation of new regulations and laws related to financial crime compliance for various sectors. So is it possible for you to comment on how you see this evolving, and is there a roadmap in mind already?
So I think the NRA will lead to a change in regulation in certain areas, and the 200 actions that come on it really drive those changes. So firstly, this is the first time we've done a coordinated exercise where centrally we put together where we consider the risks are higher and lower. Now, under the FATF standards, you can apply simplified due diligence or exemptions in areas where lower risk can be demonstrated. But now that we have put this together, it will no longer be possible to offer exemptions or simplified in certain types of activity. And that will signal a change for the industry. And that will be something we'll be consulting on over the coming years. The other things I think where you'll see change will be around more around how things are done. So particularly in the areas domestically in Jersey of supervision, supervision should be focusing on the higher risk identified areas inside the sector. So a good example here is in the area of TCSPs. Two areas were identified where both understanding and focus needed to be enhanced, and that was in the area of PEPs and in the area of the use of complex structures. So we'll see probably more focused and more targeted supervision in those areas. So that's an important thing to consider there. I think the other projects that will be are around trying to review and enhance the way we do things with the authorities. And that's a particular area where I think we'll use technology to try and enhance this. So that would be from really all the information we get in, whether it be SARS, whether it be intelligence, whether it be mutual legal assistance, trying to use a technology platform so that all the dots can be joined up by agencies if there are red flag indicators or suspicion. That will also lead us to more work with the industry to try and raise awareness. And a very popular topic in the world of financial crime, as you all know, are the creation of gimlet type structures. And I think we certainly will be looking at what we can do with the private sector in order to have a better dialogue around risk and a better dialogue about individual situations, and also how we can use technology in a two-way basis to inform the private sector around emerging risk and emerging trends. So yes, it will result in changes, and I think those changes will be more positive. And in the long term, the aim of all of risk assessments in this area is to achieve that more uniform understanding across the entire industry, which I think in Jersey we're very comfortable that we probably can do, and indeed have made a good start on. We just need to continue to progressing that risk understanding in a new way.
Right. So George, how different would you say it is to run an NRA for an IFC as compared to a mainstream sort of jurisdiction? Are there any specific learnings from the approach and experience that you had during this NRA that maybe other IFCs could benefit from? And in general, what are the critical success factors for a successful NRA?
So I think it's very different to run an NRA from an IFC perspective. The reason being is because the reach of your financial activity is so broad compared to an onshore mainstream country. It means that you need to do a lot more in order to understand that. Even in our largest three sectors, particularly two of them, so TCSP and funds, the range of activity that's conducted in those two sectors is really huge. It's not the same as if you're dealing with a large onshore country in Europe or in North America or anywhere in the world. You will have a large domestic retail banking population. You will have securities, which predominantly will be people's pensions and investment funds. These are, in the IFC context, we're dealing with a completely different set of players. We're often dealing with structures that are very bespoke, set up for very specific purposes. And for us, it's about developing that understanding in a more detailed way sooner rather than later, really, in order to understand it. So I think my two messages would be the best thing to do is to start early, to gather data that would be useful for you in trying to understand what goes on inside the industry. And then the ultimate point will be that the only sure outcome of a risk assessment is probably more risk assessments. And indeed, for us in Jersey, that's what we'll be doing, because we've now realized that particularly in the three largest sectors, we now probably need to look at risk at subsectoral level. So that would be, for example, in the funds area, starting to look specifically at which fund products, so private fund products, retail fund products, and looking in much more detail about where the risk inside those products may exist and how service provision can be tailored to prevent financial crime.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, George, for joining us today for this conversation. And I think it's going to be of huge interest and benefit to the Fintelekt community. So thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks, Shirish, and much appreciated for your time today. And thanks very much to your listeners for their interest in our NRA. More can be found on www.gov.je/NRA, which also includes detail around the commitment that we have here in Jersey to fighting financial crime.
Excellent. Thanks, George.